Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at supply networks, understanding what a supply network is and how to lay it out in the form of a diagram. So if we start with that basic question, what are supply networks? It is important for us to understand that an operations goal is to produce and deliver goods and services, but in modern operations it's very rare that this is all completely in-house within a single company or organization. Almost every organization or company will have multiple levels of suppliers, whether that's they're supplying raw goods, raw materials rather, whether they're supplying components or supplying other inputs such as labor inputs. So there will be multiple suppliers going into the operation, as well as multiple customers. So we have to distinguish between a customer, which is someone who purchases a good or service from an operation, and a consumer, which is someone who actually uses the good or service as intended. So as a simple example, you can have a manufacturer of a chair, let's say, and the chair manufacturer will have its own suppliers, say for the raw material, the wood, the lacquer, the paint, the varnish and any other materials that are needed to produce that chair. However, the manufacturer may be selling to a wholesale company, a furniture wholesale company. So that wholesale company is a customer of the manufacturer, but they're not actually using the chair as intended. So they're not a consumer, they're just a customer. That wholesale company may be selling on to a furniture retailer. And again, the retailer is a customer of the wholesaler, but they're not a consumer. The person who actually purchases the chair, takes it home, sets it up and uses it to sit on, they're the actual consumer. So we usually have a single consumer of a good or service, but it may well be multiple customers. So in order for us to map this all out, this is effectively our supply network. We understand what our different levels or tiers of suppliers are and our different levels or tiers of customers. Developing a supply network diagram has a number of benefits, really. It helps us understand the end-to-end delivery of our goods and services, as well as helping to understand the nature of competitiveness within our market. So those two things are fairly interconnected. So if we consider how competitive we are as a single organization or a single operation, it's difficult today, over the last, say, 20 or 25 years, to understand competitiveness of a single firm without understanding how competitive or robust or resilient its supply chain is. The competitiveness of a firm like Argos, for example, is really dependent upon its suppliers, its goods, its materials coming in. When we look at the smartphone industry, which is another really good example, how competitive Samsung or LG or Sony are really is difficult to even begin to understand without understanding the supply networks that those organizations operate within. When we understand how competitive or how strong a supplier of, let's say, a smartphone camera lens is, that is an important piece of the puzzle in understanding how competitive that smartphone manufacturer is. Similarly, if we look forwards to the actual forward supply network, looking at the different tiers of customers, how competitive Samsung is in large part depends on its customers, not the consumers, but the customers. Those may be retailers such as Carphone Warehouse, it may be networks such as O2, Vodafone or EE. That really is necessary to understand how Samsung operates in the market, how it can access the end consumers themselves, and how competitive it is versus companies such as Apple or LG or Sony. So we need to understand and map out our supply networks in order to really understand the nature of competitiveness within the micro external environment. It also helps us understand, so developing a supply network diagram helps us identify what the significant links are. So if the recent coronavirus pandemic has taught us anything, it's that regardless of how strong a particular node in the network is, a particular firm or an operation within a network is, the network as a whole is only as strong as its weakest link. So if you have a complex supply network and most of those nodes or operations within the supply network operate flawlessly, but you have some significant nodes which have major problems, perhaps in sourcing their own materials, perhaps in transportation or location problems, then the entire network will suffer. So by mapping out the supply network as a whole, we're able to really identify what those significant links are. And lastly, a supply network really does help us understand what the long-term issues, problems, or futures are for our individual node, our individual operation. So developing long-term partnerships with key links within a network, making sure that their capacity can increase or decrease according to our own capacity needs, that we have sufficient movement down the supply chain of information about demand and market requirements. These things lead to a long-term healthy supply network. So what we're going to do is just take a look at an example and build it up, and we're going to use the example of a shopping mall. An organization or companies that own shopping malls tend to run an operation that has very clear and extended supply network connections. So if you think about what a shopping mall operation does, it doesn't actually usually have much direct contact with the consumer. So consumers enter shopping malls, and there are a lot of things, services which are provided, which are necessary, security and cleaning and so on. But the actual commercial interactions tend to happen with individual stores within that shopping mall. So we have clear distance and clear tiers of customers before we get to the end consumer. As well as this, shopping malls don't tend to specialize in cleaning or security. They have their own labor and other materials inputs as well. So for this reason, I think it's a useful organization to consider. So if we go downstream first towards our consumer, we have our first tier customers, and these are retailers. So shopping malls both supply services directly to the retailer, as well as information going back and forth between the two, particularly demand information going from retailers to the shopping mall. So in this case, the service that's being provided to retailers is space. Really, it's commercial space for retailers to set up physical stores in and operate within. As well as that physical space, there may be other ancillary services as well: cleaning services, security services, loading and unloading services, warehousing services, stock services. So there is a package of services which are offered to retailers, and that retailers pay the shopping mall directly for. So they would be our first tier customers within this supply network. And if we move down to our second tier customers, those would be the consumers themselves of the goods. So these would be the retail customers. So they will be directly buying from the retailers, and these would be people that would just, walk in and out of the shopping mall themselves, and they would form the actual consumer base of this supply network. And we have the same thing going back and forth. There's goods and services which are being provided from the retailers to the consumer. And there is information flowing both sides. So there'll be information going from the retailer to the consumer about the goods and services being sold. And then you get demand information, preference information, market information going from consumers up to the retailers. That information too usually needs to be shifting to the shopping mall so they can make sure they're providing the appropriate level of capacity and service for their own service offerings. So that gives us an understanding of the customers and the different tiers of customers involved, but we also have multiple tiers of suppliers as well. So the shopping mall themselves will not directly provide things like security, cleaning and maintenance services, so we have to contract directly with companies that will provide these services. So for security, you'll often have specialist security firms such as Securitas, which is one you may have seen on security guards badges at the university and elsewhere. There will be specialist cleaning companies as well that will have their own cleaning services which are offered to various companies. And maintenance will often in a shopping mall involve things like lighting, heating, and other services. So those will be our first tier suppliers. So they'll be interacting directly with the shopping mall. But even then, we can see that there isn't necessarily a stop in our upstream linkages. If we look at how our first tier suppliers themselves bring in resources needed for their operation, we will see other second tier suppliers that they engage with. So security is an interesting example of this. So the shopping mall themselves don't actually provide security services. They will contract with a company, let's say Securitas, which is a specialist security services company. But Securitas themselves don't often actually hire the security guards directly. They will often use a recruitment agency to recruit and then train security staff. So the security guards themselves who are manning the shopping mall itself will often be directly paid by the recruitment agency, who are paid by the security service companies such as Securitas, who are paid by the shopping mall. So you can see here that there's several different tiers before we get to the actual labor input. Even if you don't have direct labor input to your first tier suppliers, often there will be a material input as well. So the example of cleaning services will often have direct material input when it comes to, say, the actual cleaning cloths, the cleaning materials, the various detergents and other supplies. Cleaning services will not be manufacturing these themselves. They're not producing these in-house in their own operation. So they would have their own suppliers. And oftentimes their suppliers would have their own suppliers. So you see how this can quickly become a fairly complex chain. But if at any point each one of those nodes within a network has issues or problems, it could cause ramifications downstream the supply chain itself. So if there's a sudden shortage of cleaning materials, the cleaning services company that's being contracted to provide cleaning services will be unable to do their jobs. And if that's the case, shopping malls themselves will have significant operational problems if cleaning services aren't available. And that would mean the retailers would have significant operational problems as well. This is worth highlighting, particularly in our experience of the last 8 or 9 months of the pandemic. Cleaning services were often identified as an easy and cost-effective necessary service to outsource to minimize costs. And that approach has given quite serious problems to us as we try and handle the impact of a pandemic. So if we see many hospitals and other medical buildings will have contracted out their cleaning requirements to specialist cleaning service companies, which oftentimes will themselves partner or rather find their labor input from recruitment agencies. And there may be multiple links to the actual labor input themselves, as well as the cleaning supplies themselves. When it comes to something like COVID-19 and the coronavirus pandemic, we can see just how important cleaning services actually are as a frontline, necessary and really urgent service in order to maintain cleanliness within a hospital, to minimize the spread of the virus and maintain safety of hospital patients and staff. So in order for us to really understand how the operation works, we shouldn't neglect things like cleaning services, like maintenance services. We shouldn't assume that if we're in charge of a shopping mall operation, there's no need for us to really map out and track this kind of supply network because it's just commodities, and there's plenty of cleaning companies out there willing to sign contracts, but the supply network as a whole is only ever as strong as its weakest link. So it's a necessary step for us to identify the supply network, identify vulnerable or particularly important links, and make sure we manage that sufficiently.